Could Denver Broncos tight ends Okwuegbunam and Greg Dulcich be one of the NFL's top duo tight end units in the NFL in 2022 with the addition of Russell Wilson? Plus, how do they compare against the rest of the AFC West? We take a look at that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Happy Friday, and welcome back into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast here on the Locked on NFL Network, your team every day from the South Stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, senior Broncos analyst and reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger. He's the site expert, predominantlyorange.com. We also cover the Broncos for the Locked on Network and 9 News. Broncos country, once again, thank you so much for making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day, all year long, because for the true fan, there is never an off season. You can get this podcast available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format, or you can watch us on YouTube. Sayre, my friend, it's been a fun week here so far on the Locked on Broncos podcast. We have one more week of planned content when we're talking about what we're looking forward to, storylines, top players, roster long shots, and much more. We get all that in the next couple of weeks before we get into our training camp position previews, breaking everything down, my man.
It's an exciting time. We're getting that much closer to real NFL football being here, and not just, we're talking off-season topics right now. We're comparing teams, we're comparing rosters. Pretty soon we're going to be able to react to what these guys are doing on the field, which is going to be a lot of fun. So I'm excited. I actually, I enjoy this time of year. I think it's a great challenge for us as people who cover the team to come up with ideas that keep Broncos country engaged. And I hope that everybody in the comment section, everybody listening, everybody watching, I hope you're enjoying this part of the offseason as well, because we love being able to interact with you and get to talk about these tight ends today. The tight ends in the AFC West are a lot of fun to watch if you're just a general NFL fan. But I think this year it's going to be even better with the addition the Chargers made, with the addition the Broncos made. I think we're about to have some serious fun at tight end in 2022.
Oh, I'm excited, especially with Greg Dulcich and Albert Okwuegbunam set to compete at training camp here at the end of July for that tight end one position. And regardless of who wins the tight end one job, both players we expect to play a significant amount of minutes on the field this upcoming season. But I feel like we should dive into, Sayre, how the Broncos can utilize both Albert O and Greg Dulcich, whether it be solo, whether it be on the field at the same time, whether it be in different packages. So first off, let's start off with 12 personnel, one running back and two tight ends. This is what we call double tight. However, it could be a variation, right? You can have two tight ends on the field, but they're not both in line, right? A lot of teams, a lot of the old school style of offenses, when they go double tight, they usually have one tight end on one side in line, one tight end on the other side in line. The Broncos could get to that if they want to, and especially in this wide zone scheme where it's really based on stretching and stepping wide to hit the cutback or to get outside. Part of me wonders if we will see a little bit more of that double tight inline set here for the Broncos. It gives them a numbers advantage, in my opinion, against opposing defenses, depending on the front that they decide to play against Denver.
Well, and I think just having these two guys out on the field at the same time is going to be fascinating, because let's say they're paired up out there with wide receivers Tim Patrick and Courtland Sutton. I mean, you're now talking about having to cover 6'4", 6'4", 6'5", 6'6". You're having to cover all these big guys that can make plays downfield. And I think that's the one thing that really there's such a complementary skill set between these two tight ends, right? We heard Nathaniel Hackett in the Behind the Broncos episode talking about, man, this guy really gives us something that we don't have, when he was talking about Greg Dulcich. And I think that's really an established vertical threat at the position. And that's not to say that Albert O can't be that, but I think that's really where Greg Dulcich is excellent at this point in time, whereas Albert O may help you more in terms of after the catch. So I think that just opens up all these possibilities, right? You're talking about having these two tight ends on the field. That reminds me, back in the day when it used to be like Tony Scheffler and Jeb Putzier out there running around for the Denver Broncos, the glory days of those two tight end sets where you could have so many different options, even Nate Jackson at the position and Wesley Dukes, for all those people that go back that far. There was a time when the tight end position was almost like that running back position in Denver. So maybe we get back to a time like that in this offensive system with Nathaniel Hackett, where we're running that wide zone offense again. We know that these tight ends are both going to be extremely involved in the offense. And both guys can do a lot of different things for you with their athleticism, their youth, their size. I think the possibilities are certainly all on the table.
Well, and there were some things too about Albert O's game. Like we've seen him targeted on the deep ball right before, and there were a couple times where he dropped a couple of deep passes. So for him, I feel like for Albert, he has to work on that because last year the Broncos called on him a couple of times, and he had a couple of big drops downfield when it could have swung the momentum against the Ravens, potentially against the Philadelphia Eagles when the game was still close at that juncture there a little bit in that second quarter for the Broncos. And then outside of that, too, with Greg Dulcich, we've just been hearing things about OTAs, mandatory minicamp, with just about how open he is. And he's still learning the new offense. Everybody on the Broncos offensive roster is learning this new playbook that Nathaniel Hackett has brought forth. But let's talk about an area where they can, I think, utilize them a little bit more. And that is in the red zone, or as Nathaniel Hackett likes to call it, the gold zone. This is where you can get very creative. You mentioned the size that Cortland Sutton, Tim Patrick, Dulcich, Alberto, these guys have. They're 6'5", 6'4", 6'6", whatever you may have. In my opinion, this is where you can get creative. At the tight end position inside, when you're in the 20s in the gold zone, you don't necessarily have to put a guy in line. Now, one guy could be used as a decoy where he chip blocks. 1001 releases across the field. You can have a guy lined up on the outside. You can have a guy lined up inside the slot, but it doesn't necessarily have to be just your tight ends. You can have your tight ends on the outside, your wide receivers on the inside, Sayre. And this is where I expect Nathaniel Hackett and Justin Outen to be very creative this season. But if the Broncos can maximize their opportunities inside the gold zone with both of these tight ends, I tell you what, there could be something special brewing in the Valley. But Broncos country coming up here in just a moment. We're going to dive into which Broncos tight end Sayre and I believe will have the bigger season here in 2022 between Greg Dulcich or Albert Okwuegbunam or even Eric Sauber as a wild card. We get to that coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about BetOnline.net, the sponsor of today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. And BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your sports betting needs and information this season. You can find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including Major League Baseball and NFL futures. Plus, if you're a UFC, MMA, or boxing fan, or you like golf, BetOnline has you covered with all the action there as well. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and more. And BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores and news this upcoming season. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action at BetOnline.net. BetOnline, where the game starts. Which Broncos tight end will have the bigger impact here in 2022? This is definitely a little bit of a toss-up right now because of the ongoing competition we are expected to see at training camp on July 27th at the UC Health Training Center. Sayre, Bedinger, myself, we have you covered here, Locked On Broncos, every single day. And just a reminder, Broncos country, if you're not making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day, you're missing out on the best up-to-date, objective Denver Broncos news, content, and coverage that you get every single day all year long because, like we've said, for the true fan, there is never an off season. All right, Sayre, getting into our conversation here today, my friend, in your opinion, when we look at Alberto, when we look at Greg Dulcich, and even Eric Sauber at this point, which Broncos tight end do you feel like will have the biggest impact for the team this upcoming season? There's a lot of question marks and a lot of unknowns at this point.
There really are, which is kind of fun. It makes it interesting what we're going to see at training camp here and how we're going to see these guys rotating. I think we could see some of Saubert rotating with that first team offense. I don't think that would be not a stretch by any means based on how much playing time he got last year and the things that he showed when he got playing time, especially in the blocking department, which is not necessarily, I don't want to call it a major weakness for both Greg Dulcich and Albert Okwuegbunam. They're going to be NFL tight ends, so they obviously can do it a little bit. But I mean, that's really where Saubert was great last year that we got to see anyway. So I think we could see that for sure. But I'm going to go. I'm riding this Greg Dulcich hype train, Cody. I know we talked about it earlier in the offseason, but man, when you hear everybody on the organization really just talking about him and talking him up, that was so, maybe it was just so atypical of the previous regime. Like that kind of respect on the field should always be earned. but the positive vibes to the media from the coaches or from anybody else was really, that was more, you had to really dig for those nuggets with Vic Fangio. Whereas with this regime and Russell Wilson coming in, you hear a lot of great things about Greg Dulcich, just the intelligence that he brings to the table. And of course, like we've mentioned before, Nathaniel Hackett raved about this guy can do things for our offense that we don't have. So they clearly feel like Greg Dulcich is going to be a big piece of the offense, provided he can stay healthy. And so I'm riding that train of saying, hey, I'm a dynasty fantasy football player. I'm going to find a way to draft Greg Dulcich this year, hopefully. But I have a feeling that he's going to really excel in this offense very quickly. If the first thing they're noting about him is that he's bringing intelligence to the table and a high football IQ, I think he could make a very early impact.
Well, if you are a dynasty football player like Sayre and myself, make sure you check out the Locked On Dynasty Football podcast hosted by Marcus Mosher. Free and available everywhere you get your podcast, as well here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Outside of that, Sayre, look, I agree with you. I would not be surprised if Dulcich was the guy, but for the sake of playing devil's advocate here, you went with Dulcich. I'll go with Albert Okwuegbunam, especially for him. This is a critical year as he enters another year in Denver. Missed a good portion of one season due to the torn ACL, was banged up a little bit, and we saw just flashes from Albert O. We've seen the glimpses, like when he was fully healthy his rookie season, and we started seeing him making some of these plays he did across the middle of the field against the New England Patriots in that game where the Broncos ended up winning on the road. Huge win for them, by the way. Albert O was monumental there. And then also getting one of those cheeks down against the Chargers in the Broncos comeback victory, that was huge as well. And Albert has the big play capability. However, can he piece it all together? You and I have talked about this ad nauseum here on this show. Last year, the Broncos offense really wasn't tight end friendly. So when the tight ends had an opportunity to make a play, that's where you had to step up and do it. And unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of consistency there. Now, I will say this, Albert O's run after the catch ability is something I think the Broncos really need to find a way to utilize a little bit more. I go back to that Philadelphia Eagles game where he caught a pass at about 4 yards and took it 66 yards. Should have scored on that play, by the way. But that's just a little bit of that flash and that special mentality that Albert O does have. And what was more impressive for me, he did that post ACL. He still has the speed. He still was able to get at a high mile per hour rate there to get the Broncos downfield. Albert O, in my opinion, Sarah, I feel could have a significant impact, and particularly in the red zone. I mean, there's so many options that we've talked about here. I think Greg Dulcich, as he continues to find a way to learn during his rookie season, is he going to run into that rookie wall that we sometimes see these skill players run into? Albert O has so much to prove, I think, this upcoming season. And he even said it, too, coming into the season. He said, I was told I was tight end one, and I'm going to do whatever I can to live up to that hype there. And it's going to be so critical for he and Russell Wilson to be on the same page and for Albert O to overcome some of those drops. If he does overcome a little bit of the drop issues that he has had so far throughout his career, I tell you what, Sarah, I think we can see Albert O unlocked a little bit here this upcoming season with Russell Wilson in this Nathaniel Hackett-led offensive scheme. Broncos country, we're interested to know who you believe will have the biggest impact at the tight end position for this Broncos team coming up here in 2022. But before we get into our next conversation where we compare the Broncos tight end group with some of the top players at the position inside the AFC West, let me tell you why it's an exciting time to be a Colorado sports fan, because guess what? There is a Locked On podcast for you. You listen to Locked On Broncos every single day, but if you're a Locked On, geez Louise, but if you're a Colorado Rockies fan, make sure you're checking out the Locked On Rockies podcast. If you're a Denver Nuggets fan, make sure you check out the Locked On Nuggets podcast. And if you're an Avalanche fan, you have to make sure that you are dialed in to the Locked On Avalanche podcast. We have a show for every major sport here in Colorado, here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Jumping into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, we're going to take a little bit of a glance around the AFC West as it pertains to the tight end position. But first off, Broncos country, thank you so much for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. We appreciate you so much for all the interaction that you provide to us here on the show. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please do us a favor. If you could go to Apple Podcasts, write a review, and leave us a 5-star review. If you love the show, tell us why you tune in every single day. Leave your Twitter handle in the review, and you'll be automatically entered into any future contest giveaway that we do here on the show. Plus, you can now leave a review on Spotify. Leave us 5 stars if you love Locked On Broncos. Sayre, let's take a look around the AFC West, my friend. I think when I was drafting up the show script here to talk about it, I look at maybe how the Broncos may utilize multiple tight ends this season, and then I factored in and compared it to the rest of the AFC West. realistically speaking, Denver might have more of a high volume utilization rate at the position than some of the other teams inside the division. First off, let's start off with Kansas City.
Definitely Kansas City. We know that Travis Kelsey is one of the best tight ends, not just in the NFL today, but I mean he's creeping in that all-time list, which Broncos fans, of course, don't really like to talk about that or hear about that. And of course, we got Shannon Sharp in our team history. And so nobody likes to talk about greatest tight ends of all time and include Travis Kelsey in the discussion. It's kind of like me with LeBron James in basketball when you're talking about Michael Jordan. And that's a different argument for a different day. But Travis Kelsey is undoubtedly in the best tight end discussion now and probably going forward as we look at his legacy as a player. And the Chiefs haven't really needed a second. You know, we're talking about tight end pairings in the AFC West. Travis Kelsey kind of does both roles by himself, doesn't he? I mean, he can
Yeah.
play a two tight ends role. He does it all out there. So he's one of the more complete tight ends in the game. I know the Chiefs, remember last year they drafted Noah Gray out of Duke, and it was rumored that they really liked him. As I don't know if maybe the heir apparent to Travis Kelsey, because we know Travis Kelsey is about in 31, 32 years old or whatever he is. So but Travis Kelsey is like, no, you know what? Noah Gray, he can basically take a red shirt last year. You know, he's not going to be playing. I'm going to stay on the field. So we may not see a lot of Noah Gray, but I think Travis Kelsey, I mean, just having him alone, it's like, all right, well, if you got him as your number one, your number two doesn't really matter. You're still going to have one of the best duos in the West.
Well, especially with how Kansas City utilizes as many wide receivers as they will this season, not to mention Clyde Edwards-Helaire as a running back out of the backfield. Travis Kelsey is the do-it-all type guy. In line, good at run blocking. He's a pain in the rear end if you have to try to devise a game plan to limit him. And it's very tough. Like, he has been someone who has absolutely impacted, all the matchups that the Broncos have had against him. I mean, he has been a thorn in the side. And obviously, he's a player you love to have on your team, a player you hate to have to go against. And, that's, I think, the dynamic, the ultimate sign of respect here for Travis. Now I'm going to go to the Las Vegas Raiders. I mean, kind of looking at them, I'll be very intrigued to see if we see a little bit more two tight end sets this year now that Josh McDaniels is coming over. Now we know a couple, last offseason, they brought in Jonnu Smith. They brought in Hunter Henry, former Los Angeles Charger in New England, and they utilize a little bit of a two tight end set. So now with Josh McDaniels now in Las Vegas, you have Darren Waller, who's really just this weapon, just like Travis Kelsey, the versatile, can line up outside, inside, inline. He can do anything that you ask him to there, but they like the matchups that they get on the outside against some of the smaller defensive backs. Now, you have Foster Moreau, in my opinion, I think is a very good run blocker for them on the offensive side of the ball. And I also think he's probably one of the most underrated pass catchers at the position there. He's not the guy that's going to see a lot of high volume. He's going to block, and then he's going to release and get a pass in the flat or maybe about 4 or 5 yards, and he's going to pick up a first down. They have a pretty good tight end system there in Las Vegas. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And then let's open it up with what the Los Angeles Chargers have.
Well, I completely agree. I think that the Raiders have the best tight end duo in the AFC West with Foster Moreau and Darren Waller. And I think Foster Moreau, he really exemplifies exactly what you're talking about when you say, hey, what's a really good tight end to look like in the NFL? He is that guy. I mean, Darren Waller, we know, is the guy that can move around the formation and basically play like a big wide receiver role because, I mean, even he was a wide receiver back at Georgia Tech back in the day. So he can play all of these different positions on your offense and be effective as your top receiving option. We've seen that. Now Devontae Adams is in that space. So how does that affect Darren Waller going forward? Does that make him even better and even more effective? That's going to be fascinating to see, but I think that the Raiders have the best tight end duo in the AFC West. Darren Waller and Foster Moreau, they complement each other extremely well. Like you said, Foster Moreau, very good run blocker, but an underrated receiver. I was just looking at his numbers because I know he's made quite a few plays. I see him pop up on the NFL Red Zone channel all the time. He's got 10 touchdowns in his first 3 NFL seasons, and he's in a contract year this year. So going to be interesting to see if Josh McDaniels and Dave Ziegler and the Raiders front office there, if they can keep him around after this year, because I think he is kind of a key piece for them. And the Los Angeles Chargers, they're kind of in the same boat as the Denver Broncos a little bit. You got one guy that's shown a lot of good things and another couple guys that are more upside than anything else. But I think the Chargers have an interesting group as well.
Well, the addition of Russell Wilson's former teammate this offseason, Gerald Everett, who came over from the San Francisco 49ers. He spends time with the Rams, the Seahawks, and now he's a member of the Chargers here. They have him, and I think he has the positional versatility to stretch the field. They even do some end around stuff with him. I imagine we're going to see a little bit of that open up inside the offense. I've seen some Chargers fans allude to the fact that they may utilize Everett on some jet motions, which I'm like, hey, if you ask the Denver Broncos of 2019, Rich Scangarello about that, probably not a good idea to get your tight end involved on end arounds, in my firm opinion. I know it's a Broncos country will completely agree with me on that. That was painful to watch. But there is an under the radar guy, in my opinion, Sarah, that I've always kind of been worried about with the Chargers. He hasn't had the chance, I think, to get as much play time, I think, in the eyes of Broncos matchups. But man, there's just times when he's playing another team, I watch him. That's Donald Parham. He's 6'8". This dude has ridiculous size, and he's also pretty underratedly fast for how tall and how big he is. Now, last year, when the Broncos were set to play him, I think he was out due to having a concussion. He suffered a very, very scary concussion-like injury during a Thursday night football game and had to be carted off. This is a guy, in my opinion, that makes it very, very difficult if you're a defense, because you have to worry about Keenan Allen. You have to worry about Mike Williams. And then you have a guy like Donald Parham with his size. If you just run a little pick route with the number one receiver and you put Parham as that number two guy, you run an arrow route, he's going to catch that and he's going to get in. But this is a guy, in my opinion, Sarah, that I feel like could be the most legitimate sleeper player at the tight end position inside the entire AFC West. How do you feel about Parham?
He's a fascinating guy. I just picture him reaching over the goal line. It's kind of like Michael Jordan on Space Jam at the end of the movie where all the aliens are trying to hold him back and his arm just extends the entire length of the court. That's kind of how it feels when Donald Parham is reaching over the goal line with the ball. He's just incredibly long, and he's got the ability to do those kind of things. I mean, 6'8", he is a big target for them. And Cody, what's fascinating about Donald Parham is, over the first 2 seasons of his career, the quarterback rating for Justin Herbert and whoever, if any backups ever threw to him in the regular season, the quarterback rating when they're throwing to Donald Parham is over 122. So
Golly.
very, very effective throwing the ball to this guy. He's got 6 touchdowns among 30 receptions. So 1 out of 5. I mean, he's Fulton Reed out there. 1 out of 5. Every 5 receptions he has, he's got a touchdown. So it's very interesting to me that the Chargers are able to mix these two guys. And Gerald Everett, that was a fascinating thing to me too, because I felt like maybe Russell Wilson would say, hey, let's bring this guy over. He just had a really good season with me in Seattle. And we obviously traded Noah Fant to the Seahawks. So kind of interesting. The Broncos didn't go after him, and that the Chargers did. I know they drafted Trey McKitty in the 3rd round of last year's draft as well. So they have a lot of guys out there. Like I said, there's a lot of upside, a lot of talent, but maybe not so much in the overall production department. Can Donald Parham take that next step this season? Can he become a number 1 tight end for you and make Gerald Everett kind of that secondary option? Now that would really be something. And I think that would give the Chargers maybe rivaling the Raiders. And of course, the Broncos have the opportunity to get in that discussion as well with their 2 guys, but we just got to see it happen. So I think the Chargers have a pretty solid group, especially with Justin Herbert throwing them the ball. We know he likes to spread the ball around to every weapon in that offense.
Well, Broncos country, Raiders nation, Chargers fans, Chiefs kingdom, what do you think about what we've discussed with the AFC West tight end positions? Let us know in the comment section down below. In Broncos country, that will wrap up today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. We appreciate you so much taking time out of your day to listen or to watch us talk all things Denver Broncos football, so you stay in the know with the latest objective coverage of all things orange and blue. Sarah and I will be back next week for a brand new episode of Lockdown Broncos. Some of the themes that we're going to discuss next week: top 5 players to watch this upcoming season, top 5 storylines, who are some breakout players that Broncos country needs to keep an eye on, and who are some roster long shots as well. You get that and much more all throughout next week on Locked On Broncos.